Multipolarity is just a fancy way of saying that there is not going to be a dominant power in the world. For the last 30 years, we've been living in a unipolar world where the United States was the top dog, we were more powerful than everybody else, and it was unquestioned. From about the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union, we lived in a bipolar world, which is not to say that the world was insane, although it was always a little bit demented, but which is to say that the Soviet Union and the United States were the two most powerful countries in the world, and they were calling the shots. We're living in a multipolar world, and that multipolar world is going to emerge over the next 5 years. And that just means that we have rising and falling great powers all over the place. There's not going to be one country calling the shots. There's going to be lots of countries that are either declining, advancing, etc. So let's kind of go through and take a little tour of what's going on in the world. This is my favorite map. It's in every single presentation I do, no matter what I'm talking about. Even if they told me not to talk about China, I would drag this map out. This is China's view of the world from a strategic perspective. The one word takeaway I want you to have from China's perspective is that it's incredibly weak. When China looks out at the world, it is surrounded on all sides by U.S. Defense Treaty allies. So just look at that map. South Korea, U.S. Defense Treaty ally. Japan, U.S. Defense Treaty ally. The Philippines, a U.S. Defense Treaty ally. We don't have an official defense relationship with Taiwan, but underneath the scenes, we do a lot of work with Taiwan, and we'd probably intervene if China did anything with Taiwan. China has one defense treaty relationship in the entire world. We have 3 just in the Asia-Pacific region. China has 1, North Korea. If you're bringing North Korea in a knife fight at the bar, they're your only friend that's coming to your aid, you're in a lot of trouble. And that's where China is right now. The previous speaker, I agree with many things that he said, but the one place I would differ with him is I'm not worried about China invading Taiwan over the next 5 years. Not even a little bit. And why am I so blasé about that? It's very simple. They don't have the ships, they don't have the planes, and they're surrounded on all sides by enemies. Now, do they want to? Yes. Are they modernizing their military and throwing as much money as they can at their military-industrial complex to get there so that that threat means something? Yes. Is it going to take them 5 to 7 years to do that, though, to get to that point where we would actually blink if they made the threat? Yeah, that's the timeline. So I'm really not worried about China from that perspective. When you think about China from a political perspective, from a trade perspective, from an economic perspective, from a military perspective, you're dealing with a weak power, and they're going to behave like a weak power. They're going to be paranoid and afraid and think that you're out to get them because they're surrounded on all sides. Everybody thinks we're headed towards a Cold War 2.0 with the United States and China. I think that's wrong. I think you'll get things wrong if you think of things that way. There are a lot more countries out there than the United States and China, and if I'm right about this multipolar world, all these other countries that have their own interests and their own trade relationships and their own geopolitical imperatives are going to affect the world in much more ways. That may sound a little amorphous, so let me also just bring it right down to how it affects investments at a very general way. In the unipolar moment, good idea to invest in the most powerful country in the world. So this chart stops before COVID-19 and stimulus because I think that makes things a little bit wonky. But if we go from 1990 to 2019 and you were managing investments, best thing you could have done was just passively park it in an S&P 500 index and go have lunch, play some golf. You really didn't need to do much else. Geopolitical analysts like me, we weren't really talking that much because that was the same advice for 30 years. The United States is the top dog, and that's really all there is to it, and people don't want to hear that message over and over again. In an era of globalization with one power, you also want to get exposure to the countries that are going to benefit from the most of globalization if you don't just want to sit in the United States, if you want a little bit of diversity. So pick the countries that are going to dominate from a trade perspective. Germany has done extremely well over the past 30 years. China, whatever you think about the Chinese Communist Party, whatever your feelings about Taiwan and the Uyghurs and everything else, they are the world's factory. And they've been the world's factory for the last 30 years, and they've generated immense wealth over the past 30 years, especially relative to where they started in the 1990s. It also pays if you're Canada or you're Mexico and you're close by to that regional hegemon. That's what you do in a unipolar era. I did an interesting thought exercise as I was preparing for this particular event. I wanted to go back and look at what conventional opinion was saying in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And this is a smattering of newspaper covers, magazine covers, things like that from that time. You'll see that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the conventional wisdom was Japan is going to rise and displace the United States as the biggest economy in the world. Germany can't possibly reintegrate East Germany into its economy and do anything well. The euro is terrible and it's going down.
America's going broke, it has too much debt, China can't deal with its internal problems, and by the way, Scientific American says we've hit peak oil. Every one of those things was wrong. So think about the conventional wisdom today. We'll get to that in just a moment. What should you do in a multipolar world? This is from a study we did at Cognitive Investments recently. We were just looking over the past couple of years. What is the dispersion between different countries? If you start picking different countries that you think are going to do well in a multipolar era versus countries that you think are going to do badly, can you actually show that there's going to be differences in investment returns? And it turns out you can. You can get 41, 50% differences between the top and the bottom if you're able to pick the countries that are going to do well in a multipolar era, and if you compare them against the countries that are not going to do well. So it's not a unipolar world. We're not just throwing darts at the board and saying who can trade more. We have to think about who has resources, who has good government policy, who isn't being affected by cultural and societal instability, who has good demographics. Those are some of the things we need to think about in a multipolar world. Second of all, in a multipolar world, the dominant former hegemon is probably not the place to be. Now, I'm not saying run to the exits. I'm not saying the United States is collapsing. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that by definition, there is more opportunity outside of the United States than there is inside the United States. And really what we're looking for here is we're looking for that next Japan, that next South Korea, that next China, that next country that's going to take that step and modernize and industrialize and take advantage of some of these things. So again, I don't think the United States is going to fall flat on its face. I don't even think the United States is weakening. But relative to other countries in the world, the United States is not as strong as it used to be. And that's going to show up in investment terms too. In terms of the conventional wisdom today, here's a smattering of the things that I would caution you from thinking. Electric cars are the future of transport. There's going to be a war between the United States and China over Taiwan. The dollar is definitely dead. Europe is going to freeze in the winter because they can't get any energy from Russia. And apparently Saudi Arabia is going to be a gleaming paradise in the middle of the Arabian desert. All examples of conventional wisdom that I would ask you to sort of sit with for a second and say, is that Japan in 1980? Is that peak oil in 1980? There's a lot of this stuff around, and I think you need to challenge it from that multipolar perspective.
That's from a trade perspective. I want to really dive in, though, or drill in a little bit more on what deglobalization means. This is a chart of short-term interest rates in the United States, the European Union, and China. These are the three most important economies in the world. As you can see, going back about 25 to 30 years, for most of the last 25 to 30 years, these economies moved in concert together. Short-term interest rates here being a proxy for that. So when China raised interest rates, the United States usually raised interest rates. When the European Union or the European Central Bank lowered interest rates, we usually followed them. There were differences in magnitude, but in general, the direction was the same until, as you can see on that chart, roughly 2020. And since 2020, that relationship between the three biggest economies in the world has completely broken down. We no longer all have the same economic interests in common. Now, you know this personally from your own personal experience. In the United States, the Federal Reserve is hiking interest rates. The economy's been running hot. The Fed is worried about inflation. It's trying to engineer a soft landing in the economy. That's the environment that we're in right now. The European Central Bank might have followed us in raising interest rates earlier this year, except for the inconvenient fact that Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And the European Central Bank did not feel comfortable raising rates because they knew they were going to get a huge spike in energy prices and food prices, and they didn't want to put more pressure on the European economy. So they kept things pat. They're only just now talking about raising rates. The ECB talked about a 75 basis point raise last week. China is in an economic crisis. China's been slashing rates and doing everything they can to stimulate the economy for the last 6 to 8 months. And I want to dwell on that for a second here or two. This is a chart of China housing price growth from March 1999 to 2022. You can see that in 2022, we're having a little nosedive. They had a little nosedive in 2012. So they've given us signs that maybe they had a real estate crisis before and come out of it. But it looks particularly bad this time. Now, why am I so worried about a Chinese real estate crisis, and why are we talking about the Chinese economy right now? It's because of this. This shows you what the average investor or the average citizen has in terms of their savings in the United States, in Japan, and in China. In the United States, we like the stock market. There's probably something cultural in there that we're all gamblers and we like to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. Most of our money goes into the stock market and whatever company we think is going to do well. In Japan, they're relatively conservative. They've got some housing, they've got some stocks, but a lot of stuff is kept under the mattress. They've got deposit accounts that they're pretty reliable on. Look at China and look at the housing stock in China compared to what they own in terms of stocks and what they own in terms of fixed income. The average Chinese investor, the average citizen in China, puts their money in real estate to protect it from the Chinese government. One of the reasons they do that is because the Chinese government doesn't actually charge real estate taxes right now. So if you want to protect your money from the Chinese Communist Party, real estate is a good way to do that. And what's happened is that the average Chinese citizen now, not the mega wealthy, the average Chinese citizen who has some savings has 2 to 3 to even 4 properties, whether it's apartments or condos and things like that. And the entire system is a Ponzi scheme where people pay money up front, the developers go and build and feel guaranteed that they can sell their property for higher prices down the road. So when housing prices start to go down in China, it's not just that we're looking at the Chinese economy failing, we're seeing that their entire model going forward is showing us signs of weakness. Now, why is that important? I love this chart. This shows you global steel production going back to the 1950s. One of the craziest statistics that I always like to trot out is that China's produced more steel in the last 10 to 15 years than the United Kingdom has produced in its entire history. So going all the way back to the start of the British Empire. That's how much steel China's produced just in the last 10 to 15 years. We could do this chart for corn, we could do it for soybeans, we could do it for literally any commodity that China imports at scale. We do not appreciate just how much Chinese consumption is the engine of the global economy. In some ways, that Ponzi scheme that I described, where we're going to keep building and where the Chinese are going to keep making more and more money, we're all exposed to that. And if we're looking at Chinese demand falling off a cliff because the system isn't working anymore, if we're looking at an 2008 subprime mortgage crisis in China ×5 in an environment where they all have their money in the housing market, you can begin to see that maybe the buckling of the Chinese economy is going to cause us some problems and maybe will drive down commodity prices here in the short term. I want to problematize that a little bit for you, though, because the news is not all bad on that front. Remember that China imported a lot more pork and a lot more corn from the United States in the past couple of years, even as it was trying to wean itself off of trade with the United States. They're going through an incredible drought right now. And this seems to be a theme in the world. Everywhere I look in the world, there seems to be water issues right now, something to do with that double dip and probably triple dip La Nina. But in general, the Chinese government, the government line is that they may have yields of 50, 75% lower than they did last year in terms of their grain production as a result of these droughts that they're facing now. So on the one hand, you have Chinese consumption seems to be teetering. On the other hand, they're probably going to need a lot more agricultural imports here in the next year, the next 2 years, if these drought things come to pass.
So the question, kind of a follow-up to that Turkey thing, I guess, given that they were just declined kind of EU membership, I guess maybe 5 years ago, mostly on Erdogan, I guess if Erdogan leaves, is there a potential kind of combination of EU policy and Turkey policy, I guess, increasing that sphere of influence?
If I'm right, no. And I could be wrong, but I think no. I think that any Turkish leader is going to try to assert Turkish power that way and that they won't turn the clock back on that. Now, I do think that if the opposition manages to take over, we won't get this crazy monetary policy that Turkey has. So Erdogan bases his monetary policy and where he directs the central bank to raise interest rates based on what he reads in the Quran. So I don't think that will happen. And I think you'll see more investment and probably more Western countries willing to deal with Turkey. I think you would also probably see Turkey turn much more hostile towards Russia. Erdogan wants to play both sides with Russia. I don't think the Turkish opposition is here for that. But just because you would get a slight improvement in ties and things would feel a little bit more normal, I don't think there's no putting the genie back in the bottle here. Turkey is strong and Turkey does think that it deserves this role, and it's going to be a Mediterranean power no matter who's in office. Yes, sir.
What's the potential for India to take leading manufacturing market power within China in the next some years?
So the question is, what is the potential for India to take manufacturing capacity from China over the next couple of years? That's a great question, and I've worked with several companies that are trying to figure out, all right, we have to get out of China. We know we have to get out of China. Where are we going to go? And they don't want to go to India. They see all the problems. They see that it's just, we got the infrastructure and the government and the red tape and things are terrible. And they cast about and they look for other options, and India ends up being the best of the worst. So I think India does stand to be a major winner from this, with the caveat that India has a lot of work to do on its infrastructure if it's actually going to rise into that position. India, for example, has a severe water crisis. The Indian government estimates that by 2030, India is going to consume double the amount of water that it actually produces at home. When Narendra Modi became Prime Minister of India, I believe in 2014, one of his promises was that all Indian households would have a toilet in their home by the time his premiership was over. That's the level of development we're talking about here. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people who don't have indoor plumbing.
So yes, India stands to benefit, but it's also a more multipolar world. It's not going to be globalization. India is also very jealous of its own sovereignty and its own independence. They would love to be the next China. They're not going to be, but they will have some benefit from that.